Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening and goeienaand, shalom. Good people, welcome to another episode of Liberty and Friends, only on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. My name is Sindile Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. Oh my goodness, do I not have a fantastic show for you tonight? A truly veritable mix of thinkers and opinion makers, thought leaders, if I'm to steal from an old Daily Maverick column that I don't know if it's still on, but anyway, I'll steal the term. Thought leaders on the show tonight. Welcome to it. And you know what it is. The only price of admission, as I always say, is hit that like button, smash that like button. That is your only price of entrance. And make sure you share the link out to your friends. I see the numbers are growing indeed, looking very good. Remember, hit that like button. It does help with the algorithm, whether you're watching on what is a simulcast on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook right now. Welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. Remember, this is the show that wraps up the news week that was. Maybe you saw a headline this week that got you talking, it made you angry, smile, laugh, whatever the case may be. Here, we have a revolving panel of guests who help us unpack those headlines and provide news, opinion, and analysis on them. Speaking about that very panel, let me get straight to it. And just as I do that, a shout out to you who are moderators on YouTube. Remember how I like it. Keep it classy, keep it clean, and please remove people who are trolling or who are derailing the conversation. We want to keep on target here. As tonight on Liberty and Friends, we zoom in and focus on effectively what has been a South African economy that is on the ropes. It is being punched to death by a political elite in this country with bad policy on the one hand, a lockdown which doesn't seem to be ending, and of course a global economic environment which is bringing headwinds our way. To help us unpack those issues and more, we have joining us tonight the CEO-elect of the South African Institute of Race Relations. I'm talking, of course, about John Endres. John, good evening and welcome to Liberty and Friends.
How's it, Sindile? Good to be back with you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Excellento.
John, if you can, just try and raise your levels. You're a little faint, but let me see if it's the problem is on my side. No. Just raise your levels. But with that being said, welcome to it. Good to see you. John, of course, was on the show this Wednesday as we unpacked quite a few other issues on that. So if you can, after the show, make sure you check out that episode. I might even link it at the end. Another firm favorite on the show, someone who has been on here quite regularly. I know you guys definitely like him. I'm talking, of course, about 1/3 of the chaps out at the Manpatria podcast. That is Koketso Resane. Koketso, good evening.
Good evening to you, good evening to everyone else, and a good evening to our good citizens of the Republic of South Africa. We're good people, guys. We really are.
There you go. Although, as I like to call it, this is now the autocracy of Lockdownistan, but we won't get into that one right now. Moving on to my other guest, a very distinguished chap, the chief economist at the Efficient Group. I'm talking, of course, about Dawie Roodt. There he is. Dawie, good evening and welcome to Liberty and Friends.
Thank you so much. Good evening to you and to everybody else and everybody watching. Wonderful talking to you guys.
Excellento. That's Dawie Roodt, of course. And last but definitely not least, a fellow who is how do I describe this chap? And I can see him smiling in the background because he knows I'm going to butter this up. This chap, the first time I had him on the show was a smashing hit, back by popular demand, and I really mean that. Sindile Vabaza, political and social commentator. Sindile, pardon me. Good evening. Welcome to Liberty and Friends.
Oh, thank you for having me. You're very kind. You're very, very kind. You overstayed me, though. I must
admit, the comment section went berserk as I was even mentioning that. There's even mentioned shout-outs right now as we speak. Let me just put one of them on so you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Shout out to you, Graham McTaggart, a good fan of the show. Fellas, just an FYI, we may have one more guest joining us. He's currently just landing in Cape Town and making his way home. That'll be another firm favorite on the show, but I'll keep it as a surprise, just in case, however that pans out. With that being said, guys, let's get straight into it, because tonight I think the conversation is going to hinge around the economy, our personal finances as South Africans, and perhaps what I can describe as a growing sense of anxiety in the country as the economic headwinds blow very cold on the average South African, and worse yet, Dawie, I'll begin with you. Worse yet, there seemingly is a non-recognition by the political elite as to just how bad things are for the ordinary person.
Yeah. Maybe I can just maybe, if you allow me, just sketch a bit of a background of sort of a context of what's going on internationally. And all of this is happening in the international context, whereby central banks are experimenting with all sort of funny things. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Very low interest rates, quantitative easing and all that. And governments internationally spending money like there's no tomorrow. And of course, the pandemic. Those three major factors are, within those three major factors, we have the South African economy, which has been mismanaged, which has been ran into the ground at various levels the past couple of years, and all the chickens are coming home to roost this year. So everything is really, and I'll use the cliche, this is pretty much a perfect storm coming together. We've reached the end of the line for the state-owned enterprises. We've reached the end of the line for the fiscal accounts. Pretty much, that's not completely there yet, but pretty much it means state debt levels are just totally unsustainable and going up still. Unemployment levels are at record high levels. Poverty is back. We basically succeeded in getting rid of poverty in South Africa, but poverty is back. It came back recently in the form of people going to bed hungry. Businesses are being destroyed, and confidence levels are at all-time low. And for the best part of the past 10 years, on an average basis, the average South African has been getting poorer. So that's where we are. And I am afraid, looking at the political leadership, I don't know, I've got the impression that they are simply unaware of what's going on, or I certainly do not get the impression that they're in any hurry fixing the problems that we have currently in South Africa. And to be honest, I wonder if our political leadership, I'm talking about cabinet mostly, if they really have the capacity and to put people in the right places to make the right decisions and actually implement those kind of decisions. To put it shortly, I am seriously concerned about South Africa's economic and political future, by the way. And I believe our problems are mostly political, not economic.
That's right. And again, a proper sketch of what is a rather depressing overall picture. John, I want to cross to you, because we sort of had this conversation, and Dawie rightly sets it out, that it has its roots, or it finds its roots primarily in the local policy environment, the local political environment. But of course, it is fed, there's various factors that feed into it. But really, at the end of the day, and I want to quote you directly, albeit you're making a different point, at the heart of what we're seeing, the ANC is at the center of that.
Yeah, that was a comment I made when we were talking about the riots in KZN the previous month, where there is a debate around whether it was an insurrection or just looting or just violence or just, what was it? But somebody pointed out to me that the common thread linking all of these things, whatever the explanation might be, is the ANC. So, if it is a faction fight, if it is the RET faction, if it is an insurrection, that has to do with the ANC. But equally, if it is driven by poverty and hopelessness and hunger and despair, that is also driven by the ANC by means of its policies. And I think there's a sort of an interesting analogy to be made here, which is the case of Venezuela, which introduced socialist policies in the early 2000s. And things went kind of well for a while until about 2013. And that was because Venezuela benefited from high oil prices. And Hugo Chavez, the president at the time, benefited from being the president who presided over high oil prices and was able to spend money very easily. His successor then, Maduro, inherited the mess which Chavez created, and he did not have high oil prices to fall back on. So for him, this created huge problems. The South African parallel is that we have a more diversified economy than Venezuela, and we do have good infrastructure and a lot of resources to build an economy. But we are coasting on that, and we're coasting on empty now, I think. To back Dawie up with the point that he was making, we have at the moment a tax windfall. So the government is collecting more tax than it expected, about 50 billion rand more, because the mining companies are making such big profits. And this is allowing the government to be complacent and say, actually things are not so bad. We're still collecting lots of money, and we're using this money responsibly, they say, because we're using the money for social grant, which we're extending until March next year, but we're not increasing our debt, and this is why we are responsible. But the point is, of course, that this income, this windfall, should be used to pay down the debt and help to create breathing space. And it's very dangerous that our leaders are not recognizing this and are allowing the space to keep closing down even further. And we're going to pay for that pretty soon, I think.
Absolutely. And again, as I give everybody effectively just opening statements here, we're painting what is the picture of the South African economy, the various factors that, yes, to someone listening to us now might sound very lofty and on a grand scale, but really no. They actually impact on your pocket, dear viewer, right now. Maybe before the show, maybe you were working out your budget for the next month, after payday, if you are one of the lucky people who still have a job and are paid at the end of the month, maybe you're working out your budget for the month coming forward. These are the issues that you must understand insofar as helping you understand why your budget simply doesn't stretch as far as it does before. Sindile, let me come to you because, talk to me about this coming weekend. Guys, I will bring out specifics. I'm just really warming us up in the room. But Sindile, talk to me about the state of things right now. You have South Africans right now who are deeply worried about their own personal finances, but don't see the link necessarily between what happens at a national policy level and obviously what the impact on their local, on their personal pocket, number one. Number two, the one thing I want you to chime in on in particular is this attitude we're seeing from the political elites of almost not even caring, and almost disdain for what ordinary South Africans are going through.
I think for me, the when you want to look at sort of the economy, for me, is I look at the places which are falling behind. I know this is a conversational point that's often talked about in America, where they talk about places that are falling behind. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I thought, outside of your major cities in South Africa, there really is no industry with which you can build on and which people can get jobs and income from. So I was thinking specifically because I was born in Mthatha and I'm house sitting right now at my mom's house, and I'm thinking, I was just driving around and I was thinking, there's absolutely nothing here except government, and people don't have jobs. And because people don't have jobs, one of the things I noticed, and these are the effects of the economy, the real things, not just the finances, but the things that are born of it, is you look at young men, young military age men sitting around doing nothing. People often talk about this issue of a demographic dividend, which was used by the Asian economies to sort of get themselves away from poverty into prosperity. And we're not using it. And the downside of that is that the things that we're seeing with crime, the things that we're seeing with degradation, the things that we're seeing partly, I think, in my view, with what we saw with the awful scenes and the looting and the sort of the delight in the chaos. People's lives are already chaotic because of the state of the economy and the policy of the ANC. And in that sense, what we saw was kind of like a small window during the riots into sort of like the mindset and the psyche of people. And to reverse back to your second point, what we saw from the elites was a disconnect. The elites, what we saw was a window not just into people's lives and their psyches and what was happening with their finances and the hunger, but we saw the disconnect of the elites to that, because our elites are disconnected to people's lives as it is, and they were disconnected during the riots. People had to defend themselves. People had to figure out how they're going to raise up their businesses again after their businesses got destroyed. And the elites, all the elites ever gave us was just words and nothing. They gave us words, they gave us their platitudes, but they didn't give us anything real. Because if you listen to any of what's been said post the riot, it hasn't really touched on anything in terms of fixing South Africa as a whole structurally. It's all just reactive stuff. It's let's react, let's give a grant. We've seen a tax windfall. We're not trying to invest that to do something better in the long term and structurally. No, in South Africa, we always have to be reactive about this kind of stuff. And we're seeing now the pain that's coming. I'm seeing the comment. You're seeing the electricity tariffs. You're going to see so much go up, eat into people's pockets and their buying power. So I think our elites are disconnected from that. Our elites have been disconnected from that. So I don't know. I'll leave it up to the other panel members, but I think that would be my opening comment.
And it's an apt one because, and I want to pass it on to you, Koketso, because that last bit in particular that Sindile raises is critically important. The idea that, and I put up a comment earlier on, I think by Carol Ann Gain, it's this notion, it's just words and no deeds from those who are actually tasked with the role of not just responding, as Sindile says, but also leading the charge in terms of good ideas. Remember, at the end of the day, what we're effectively discussing here is the dearth, the lack of good ideas, market-oriented ideas that grow an economy, that absorb the unemployed and really what's ever increasingly becoming the unemployable in this country. We're seeing a lack of those ideas, instead a doubling down on the bad ideas. And then even worse, to compound that even worse, an acceptance by those who are beneficiaries of the bad ideas that we should stay the course because they happen to benefit. Of course, they're not brave enough to say that to the public. They'll always find some other cover. Either calling us right-wingers, racists for questioning bad policy or whatever. They'll find some scapegoat. But effectively, those who benefit from the current bad ideas are effectively none the wiser or even caring of those who are at the receiving end, who pay the cost of those bad decisions, Koketso.
Yeah, and that's correct. So if you look at particularly, let me call them the ruling class for now, I'm talking elected officials, those who are in municipalities and the likes, I think they've become complacent in that they make promises of, some form of economic recovery, economic prosperity. They've become content with year in, year out making these promises, and they're making these promises to an electorate who has also then become complacent with hearing promises and never seeing any action. There's a very particular thing with South Africa where we've become so numb to hearing promises that we never actually have a conversation about, right, let's look back and see what has actually been done. And I would rather look back and say, right, this was done and it didn't work. Let's learn our lessons and let's move from there. Where are the lessons learned? Where can we improve and the likes? But you can only do that if something is being done. We are in a situation where across the board, actually nothing is done. Promises are made by politicians, particularly with the economy. You'll hear this every year in state of the city addresses or state of the province addresses. You hear this year in, year out, and there's always this magical focus on, they call it the township economy, but in retrospect, what they're referring to is the informal sector at large. And they make these promises, they spit out a lot of numbers. They talk about how infrastructure is going to be developed, how investment is going to be massaged in a way, but you never actually see anything. And the people who know this is the mama who's selling vegetables on the side of the road, because she was promised that, listen, we don't like it that you're selling on the side of the road. Let's actually go out and build an environment for you to be able to do business. What you need to do is apply for a permit, and you will operate your small business without paying a fee, without paying some form of tax, without paying rent for your stall. But we will create a space where we'll put a roof over your head so that when it rains, you can sell. We'll put you right next to the taxi rank as well, so that, people can buy on their way to work and the likes. All of this was done in Johannesburg as an example. And the result is you go there now, you don't even find locals operating in that space. So again, a promise was done, a promise was made and nothing gets done. And when we look back and we now talk about how can we actually fix things, that doesn't get done either. And we who question a lot of these things are called, all sorts of naysayers and the like. But to go back to what I think it was John who mentioned it, the common denominator throughout all of this is actually the ANC, because they hold the majority of the municipalities. And when we look at local economies in particular, something like an electricity price, that actually cripples a lot of businesses. You've got people closing down their small businesses, and you might argue there that, this isn't, we shouldn't be calling for a doomsday or anything like that. But the reality is that's still how someone was feeding their family, And I made this example actually back at Manpatria that if you look at the middle class particularly, the middle class are so active in the economy that if something goes bad there, they are typically employers of a domestic help, someone who does a garden. The economic impact of your middle class being squeezed at every corner through a petrol increase, through an electricity hike, through food inflation and the like. The economic impact of that is actually very difficult to measure, but it's very catastrophic that even without measuring, you can't miss this. So our political class isn't really paying attention to this sort of thing. They don't say anything about it. All they do year in, year out is continue to make promises and give out fancy terms for operation this or a plan to do this. And we never really see the net effect of that.
Absolutely. And to that effect, let me zero in now on perhaps, as you guys have set it up quite nicely, let me bring up actual cases that we saw pop up in the headlines, the news headlines this week that speak to a lot of these problems. So, Dawie, I'm going to begin with you, but effectively, we've been having a conversation, and even on previous iterations where you've been on the show, and one of the questions I left you a while back was on the issue of which direction the country should choose. Should it choose the direction of more government intervention, more state involvement in the economy, whether it is a Eskom Transnet, Department of Small Business, Sasria, whatever, like these myriad of government-heavy, government-led, entities that interfere with the economy? That's the one route. Or do we move in a direction of actually, no, devolving power, devolving resources, devolving freedom to the individual, to families, really, for them to be decision makers in the economy? Do I start a business? Do I not? Do I sell something? Do I build something, etc., etc.? But those decisions being left to the individual and families, and the benefits of their decision making and the cost of failure being borne by them. Those are the two broad decisions that we face as a country. This week we saw a headline that spoke to how devastating the state route can be when I go to a one Transnet. This is, of course, the state-owned entity which runs most railways, ports, basically a major player, legislated player in the logistics space in the country, which have declared force majeure, basically saying we cannot operate simply because our systems as Transnet have endured some form of cyber attack. They didn't have contingencies, and they didn't have contingencies to the point where they actually had to shut the gates at ports and nothing moved. There was lines, Dawie, of trucks, for example, trying to not only leave a port, but also get into a port. And this had massive implications for the economy. This week we found out, in fact, if I find my notes here, just 2 hours ago, actually, that same entity now says, look, after a staggered restoration of its technology, it's now ready to lift its force majeure tomorrow, that's Monday, as all operational obligations with contractors would now be met. But here's the issue, Dawie. with this thing having been exclusively in the hands of the state, nothing moved, nothing happened when the state collapsed or when this entity collapsed.
Yeah, in fact, I think the country can call for a force majeure, and it was not an earthquake or an attack on our computer systems. It was the ANC government. Because of that, the country can't produce much. Yeah, maybe let me just make 1 or 2 comments about some of the things that my fellow panelists what they've referred to. I think it was John and Sindile referred to the tax windfall or more taxes that we're collecting. I just want to put that in perspective because that is very important. We are not collecting more taxes. Please, people, please don't stop saying that, because if we keep on saying we're collecting more taxes, people think there's going to be more money to be spent. Of course, the politicians think that already, and they've already spent the so-called more taxes. We're not collecting more taxes. It really depends on what you compare it to. And I think that's the trick here, is that, I've got one of my colleagues, he keeps on telling me, you cannot budget yourself out of trouble. You cannot budget yourself out of trouble. And that is in a way what they're trying to do here. The Minister of Finance is trying to budget us out of trouble. So we don't have more taxes. The reality is, compared to a few months ago, certain tax kinds, like, for example, taxes on the exports of commodities are doing a little bit better than compared to a few months ago. But it's certainly not doing better compared to a year ago or 2 years ago, for instance. And then, if I may add to what Koketso said, and that will get to your point, actually, Sindile, and that is that the rising dependency on the state. The president, a week ago now, made the announcement that we're going to spend all this extra taxes, by the way, and all sort of other things we're going to spend, and we're going to put 9.5 million people, additional 9.5 million people on the books of the state. So there are today 30 million people getting an income from the state every month. Now, I can promise you that 30 million people will be getting less of an income over the next couple of years. And I can also promise you that if you pay people less, they get angry. And that's a very important reason why we've seen what we've seen recently, because people are getting less of an income. We can get an increase in poverty, and that it used to be 21 million people. Now it's 30 million people. I know only about 9.5 million will lose their very meager 350 rand by March next year anyway. But for the rest, those grant recipients and civil servants, their income will come under pressure over the next couple of years. And that's the experiment that we've been trying for many years now. So your 2 options, the one is more state interference, more dependency on the state, attempt to increase taxes. That we've tried that. We've already tried that. It didn't work. In fact, just about everything that the ANC government touches turns into some sort of disaster. And I can give you all the numbers. The local authorities, something like 70% of the local authorities are financially simply dysfunctional. The provinces, pretty much the same. Just about all the state-owned enterprises are financially and operationally have been ran into the ground. The national departments are a disaster. And the state just keeps on spending and spending more and more money. I've done quite an extensive analysis on education as an example. We in South Africa, education is the biggest expense item of the Minister of Finance, but the quality of our education is not only bad, it is sometimes the worst in the world. That gets to, I think, Sindile mentioned that it is if you drive around outside of the big cities, people are sitting around doing nothing. And there are many reasons for that. But the contributing reason for that is that people just do not have the skills. They just don't have the skills. Now, of course, there are many other reasons as well, because you don't protect private property rights, you don't invest, the state is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, you can't get an account from the state, they don't fix the roads. So we've tried the alternative, it simply doesn't work. And I've got a suspicion, and that in a way is a silver lining in South Africa. What we've seen the past 3 weeks is not only bad news, what we've seen there, but there were a couple of good things that happened as well. One thing that I saw that I think is a good thing is that the people, normal people like you and I, are actually doing what the state is supposed to be doing. They're trying to protect their own houses, their own property, for instance. And so we have, in fact, in South Africa, a state that's been trying to do more and more things for everybody. They have been a total and a complete disaster and a failure. And now they want to do even more. I mean, you must have a hole in your head. Why? It is so clear that they can't do the basic things right. Why do they keep on trying to do even more? Leave it to the private sector and do what you're supposed to be doing, and that is protect your people and protect their stuff. And you will be amazed about the energy in the private sector.
Absolutely. Again, a proper summation of things there. Koketso, I'm going to come to you and then John, because Dawie raises a very important point here, which is responsibility really should be as limited as possible to primarily the protection of life, liberty, and property rights, so that the ordinary individual is able to, pursue their happiness, pursue their opportunities. If they want to form a business, whatever the case may be. And what we're seeing instead is the opposite of that, where as the state tries to do more, the individual gets crushed. Let me be precise and specific. The state has tried its level best over the past 27 years to interfere in the market, to regulate, to not only be refereed, but to also be a player in the market, often crowding out smaller entrepreneurs, and then recognizing this problem, simultaneously setting a policy that decides winners and losers amongst those who happen to enter the market and deciding them by race, unfortunately. But we'll get to that. But what I was trying to get at is here, Dawie is quite right in saying the state has tried to do more, and lockdown has, if anything, raised that appetite for the state doing more, because it gave them incredible amounts of power, which they never had before. But now that power and that interference has a cost, an economic cost. This week I saw an article, let me just go to it very quickly here. The top Cape Town eatery, the Test Kitchen, closes its doors after 11 years of business. Now, this is the one restaurant in this country which is internationally recognized, has great acclaim, being part of the top 50 restaurants in the world. And after 11 years of operating, the owner just said, that's it. All of the investment that went into this, millions of rand, which includes, of course, investment into the staff, a lot of whom came from disadvantaged areas, were trained up to be high-quality chefs, recognized around the world. All of that comes to a stop simply because of decisions made by politicians who paid no heedance to his business and really the millions of other businesses, primarily in tourism, hospitality, and of course other sectors. But this is the issue, isn't it? This is what it means when the state has that power that Dawie is warning against.
Absolutely. So I make this argument a lot, specifically when people talk SAA and its importance to the tourism sector. And it always baffles me that people assume that to go to Cape Town, you don't have an option. You have to fly SAA, and therefore SAA must be salvaged or rescued or recapitalized or anything but selling to the private sector. And I don't mean private sector where it's your friend's company. I mean actual private sector. So people have this assumption that you need an SAA to drive tourism, and that's not true. What typically drives tourism is our beautiful landscapes, our beautiful beaches, and establishments like this restaurant you just mentioned. So when something like this closes, obviously it is not the only one. It's probably one of many, but that actually reduces the number of reasons for someone particularly someone abroad, to come to a Cape Town. But maybe to speak to the larger point here, there's that saying of if you can't win on easy, then don't play on hard. And the government hasn't been winning on easy. And I say easy because in a country where we have enough young people to make up a substantial amount of people who are eligible to work. Some countries don't have that. We have a population of 58, 59 million people, most of which are young people. Again, some countries don't have that. We have an abundance of natural resources in the ground, above the ground. Some countries don't have that. Agriculture, the list goes on and on and on. So for me, South Africa's economic growth, GDP growth, etc., all of this is actually very easy to attain. It's not difficult, and the government couldn't do that. And in them now insisting on being more involved, having a direct hand in the economic participation of citizens, that's them playing on hard. The other thing I'd like to make here is that, given the 350 that Dawie just mentioned as well, I've said this many times before, and I don't know why people just aren't getting it. Maybe I need to be more popular, but you could go and find any job, part-time or full-time, and it is still going to remunerate you more than 350 Rand a month.
Yeah.
That said, you are far better off in a job than, you're far better off in a job financially than you would be sitting at home and earning 350 Rand from the state. It is literally that simple. But we don't hear about how government is literally going to, let me say, boost the business, or, they say they do. But again, like I mentioned earlier, when you look back, nothing was actually done. They say they do, but we don't hear government. We don't see the efforts of government making it easy for businesses to keep on operating. They want to apply socialist principles where we'll give our people money. Why don't you give money to businesses so that businesses can continue to employ people? That way, you're not paying one person. When you pay one business, you're paying 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, who knows? But we're not seeing that, and it's very unfortunate. But again, this is all very basic stuff. It doesn't require a big mind to realize a lot of these things. But we know then that the government isn't exactly privy with getting some expert help when they desperately need it. They would rather host a press conference and tell us about what they want to do instead of calling in some experts and doing what they need to do.
This is the tragedy, and John, I come to you because I raised the specter of the test kitchen shutting down, because as Koketso rightly says, it's not the only case. It is sadly one of many businesses. In fact, let me be precise. When the new round of level 4 lockdown came, a lot of people, entrepreneurs in the tourism sector, hospitality, just said, that's it. At least in the first iteration of this nonsense, we had some reserves that we can fall back on. The state was paying haphazardly TERS payments, for example, but there was some semblance of, we can almost in a very Frankensteinish way patch together something, and hopefully it comes alive again when the economy comes back. But this time around, it simply isn't the case. We have nothing, as 3 restaurant owners told me this week, and I'll have them on the show 2 weeks from now. We were in a special insert that we're doing on the hospitality sector. The point I want to get here is, and I want your insights on this, it got to a point, John, where effectively the law-abiding citizen had to literally come to a point of saying, you know what, do I follow the law and risk losing everything, which is years of investment and the like, or do I break the law, risk a fine, risk imprisonment, but at least save some semblance of the job? Why am I bringing this up? During the hard lockdown, level 4, a lot of restaurants, if not the vast majority of them here in Cape Town, were happily selling alcohol on the down low. If you asked, you would get it. And they had no shame in doing it. But the question I had in my mind was, I support this to an extent, but it does speak to a broader erosion of the rule of law when good people feel like they have to break bad laws.
This is a very dangerous development, and it is one that is happening. It's occurring much more or less the way that you're pointing it out. Exactly, law-abiding citizens choosing to break the law. I think in a court of law they might be able to raise the argument of self-defense and say, my business was threatened with shutdown. That is death for a business, and I was trying to keep it alive. And the threat it was facing was government overreach. It was lockdown. It was regulations that did not allow me to operate. And in self-defense, I continued operating. And it is hard not to empathize with those business owners. I saw you posted a comment earlier as well, I think from Paula Kernan, who said that she wasn't going to restart her business.
That's right.
And I remember at the beginning of the lockdown, and I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was trying to understand how small businesses work. And I said, if you go into the lockdown, if you've got reserves, some sort of buffer, then you can stick it out for a while and then hope that things get better and then get going again. And he said, but why do most small businesses not have this buffer? And I said, because most of them spent it already in the previous 5 or 10 years because economic policies were so bad, growth was so low. They were already dipping into the reserves to keep going. And when lockdown started, they were already in a weak position. So many businesses then had to shut down at that time. And it's now been over a year of lockdown. And, even the strong businesses that had substantial reserves at the beginning of the process don't have them anymore. And it's, unfortunately, for many of these businesses, really the end of the road. And the consequences are dire for the individuals concerned, for the owners, but also for the employees and the customers, because this entire economic ecosystem, which is a complex living thing, becomes less diverse. You have fewer types of businesses, you have less competition, you have less choice, and all of this is bad for an economy. I'd like to just get back to a point that Dawie made earlier, which is, why do we see this predilection to interventionism on the part of the government? And I think a useful way to think about this is in terms of fools and knaves. So the fools and knaves idea is that either people are doing a bad thing, like, for example, intervening too much in the economy out of innocent reasons, but they mean well, or knaves is they're doing it for malevolent reasons because they mean ill. And I think it's a combination of both. So the argument for knaves is very easy to make, because, of course, the more involved the state is in the economy, the more ways there are to tap into those revenue streams and the more patronage you can distribute. And I'm sure that in many cases, government action is driven by this consideration, as unappetizing as it might seem, but it certainly plays a role. And the foolish argument, I think, is that our ideological opponents find freedom very scary. And what they say is, if you see something bad happening, like high unemployment or low growth, you need to do something about it. You would be an immoral person to let it be and not do anything about it. So you have to intervene. And then things get worse as a result of the intervention, and that then justifies even more intervention. And you get the snowballing effect where you say, things are going so bad, we have to do something. Let's do something. Oh, it's gotten worse. Oh no, we must do more. Let's do more. And it keeps going that way, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And ultimately, what underlies it really is a worldview where you say, people can't be trusted, or you can't have confidence in the ability of people to sort things out for themselves. The state has to do it for them. And when things go badly, then the state has to do something. And that is why we're seeing more and more interventionism, which to us seems, irrational. And we think it's so obvious that it isn't working. You have to do something different. But I think there is a moral argument underlying it, which says, you can't leave people to their own devices. You have to solve their problems for them.
And it's a weird ideology rather, because it just keeps seeing people and politicians dig themselves into a hole deeper and deeper. Guys, give me a second. Let me just do some due diligence here. Welcome to it. This is the halfway mark of Liberty and Friends. Remember, this is your Sunday evening news wrap-up show here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I'm in conversation with Koketso Resane, who is a co-host of the Manpatria podcast. Make sure you check them out. Shout out to Dumo Denga. I saw him in the comment section. John Endres, who is the CEO-elect of the South African Institute of Race Relations. Shout out to the guys at the IRR. Sindile Vabaza, who is a commentator. You'll find him on social media, opining on many, many things, and also a writer. I know I've read a few of your articles, Sindile. And of course, last but definitely not least, Dawie, Roodt, the chief economist at the Efficient Group. What we're basically doing tonight is a little different from the usual Liberty and Friends. We're not as heavy on the headlines that made the week, actually, if I'm to be brutally honest. But we're really unpacking some of these economic issues that I think have fallen by the wayside a bit, as we all get too focused and myopic sometimes on certain day-to-day issues that have dominated the headlines, ironically. And Sindile, maybe to this point, let me come to you, because there's a lot of chatter in the comment section. And guys, by the way, to the viewers, I'm going to, after Sindile's comment, I'm going straight to questions. So if you have a question for any of the panelists, it might be a personal finance one. There are some that I noted from earlier. I'll put it to the guests, or you have a concern about the economy, please get that question in. I'll flight it on screen and we'll chew on that. Sindile, we've really traversed a broad landscape here on discussing, the various things that have influenced our economy over the past few months, year, and of course 27 years. But at the heart of it, really, and I want to come back to something you mentioned, because it affects me insofar as how I view this country and my love for South Africans. It really is that notion that South Africa's ordinary individuals, that God-fearing, law-abiding, and family-orientated chap who lives in Plattelandse, South Africa, or some rural part of Emapumulo, where I'm from, for example, that chap is forgotten. That chap has no sense of an optimism of what the market does ordinarily for those of us who are in the middle class and in urban South Africa. Those folks who are, the forgotten, as you rightly put them, where's the hope for them and where are they right now? I mean, you're in Mthatha. Speak to me about that. I want you to unpack again that day-to-day driving around. Who are you seeing primarily sitting on the street corners?
Thank you. The one thing I do see, and I'll just tell a personal story. It's somebody I grew up with. I think I left Mthatha when I was about 6 or 7 to go to boarding school. So this is somebody I grew up with. It's somebody I grew up with when I was very, very young. Sorry. I'm busy. Oh, okay.
Trust me, I know those. I know those. You're like, hey man, I'm on the show. Welcome back. Welcome back.
Sorry, excuse me for that. I apologize for that. What I was trying to say was this. I think this is somebody that I'd grown up with. He was somebody I was friends with. And as I got back to Mthatha, what I saw is that there was a lack of opportunity for him. A lack of job opportunities for somebody who just only had a matric. And the big thing for him was all he did was ended up sitting around on the street, on the corners, asking people for money, falling to drugs. Doing one scene I saw in particular was I remember walking into the spa and seeing a bunch of men, probably in their 30s, probably near my age, and there was this lady walking past and they were all hollering at her with a beer in their hand. Hollering her like they're a bunch of like teenage boys. And I think that's the thing that happens when there isn't anything for what I'd call military age men to do. They regress. And I think that is going to give us a lot of problems. We as a panel can talk about some of the heady stuff, but in terms of real flesh and blood experience, when young men, especially, do not have jobs and do not have things that take up their time, they regress, they choose violence as a way to stand out. And part of that, and what we see in terms of some of the things that happen with women and children and the abuse, is that it gets taken out on women and children. So those are the problems that we see. And one thing I want to mention, and I was just thinking about it as we were talking about, someone in the comments said something about BEE, and I've been thinking about it for quite a while. And I think one of the biggest problems with BEE, and I think it goes to a term, it's called the bigotry of low expectations. And I think one of the problems with BEE is that it destroys Black people too. And it's something that's often not talked about because the angle is always BEE is not giving an opportunity to other people who would otherwise merit it. But here's the problem with it, is that it regresses the people it's supposed to help as well. And that's what we're seeing in South Africa. Because when young Black people look at people who benefit from BEE, BEE doesn't necessarily benefit the best people. It's as the panelists would say, the panelists would talk about something about picking winners and losers. The government essentially picks who gets to succeed amongst Black people in that system. And that's not always the hungriest, the most entrepreneurial, the most honest and upstanding, the one who can face up to the rigors of the market. It's someone who can suck off the teat of the state. And if you see that, you often see that when that's taken away, it collapses. You're seeing it now with a lot of the tenderpreneurs. is that when that is taken away, because their justification is the apartheid government helped Sanlam, etc., etc. But when you take it away, the question for me is always, for how long do you expect to be living off the teat of the government? Because that's what young people see. They think, oh, if I want the fancy car, if I want the nice life, the soft life, or whatever, etc., this is what I need to do. I need to saddle up to a politicized or political sort of system, instead of saying the values of saying freedom and the rule of law and hard work, etc., etc., etc. Those things are not, I believe the word's prescient in young people's lives. They're not something which young people see as a path forward to succeeding. And I think it's really damaging Black people in that sense, because one of the things driving around Mthatha and the complaints was that, look, these things we used to have before the advent of apartheid. If people, for the listeners of the show, Mthatha was one of the sort of independent areas during apartheid. The word just eludes me, but it was one of those areas which was given and was under the rule of Matanzima. And people, a lot of the older people are saying is that, listen, we used to own a lot of this. We used to do X, Y, and Z. But now, since the advent of 94, it's the foreigners now. It's the Somalis that own this X, Y, Z. And the thing is this, and from my vantage point, it's this. It's that when people come from other places in Africa, I know some of the studies around immigrants being successful, but people who come from other places in Africa do not have the cosseting effect of government. They do not expect it. If they don't get out there, if they don't work, if they don't do something for themselves, if they don't get entrepreneurial, they starve. It's as simple as that. They've got nothing to fall on because their governments don't have anything. Their governments can't redistribute all the gains of the sort of big business in the private sector in our big cities. And this leans back to the point I was saying earlier, which was the rest of this country outside of your big cities is simply 2.5 notches above Potemkin villages. It's a facade. Outside of Joburg, Durban, Cape Town, PE, etc., the places that have some level of industry, this place is just a facade. It's just, it's living off the redistributed value gains of the productive places in this country, which is why people are falling behind. Most of those gains, by the way, go to a non-value creating government class. It goes to civil servants, by the way. If you go and drive through Mthatha, it's the civil servants with the cars, with the houses, with the fancy stuff. I can tell you, I can almost tell you without even thinking too hard, oh, this person has a car, they probably work for the government. And that is the fundamental problem in this country. We have this thing of the bigotry of low expectations, and some of it actually comes out of what you would say, John, about fools and knaves. I believe that's what you said, fools and knaves. Part of it, and I'll say this, and it might be controversial, part of it is that part of a certain section of the white community falls for this, because I understand, because I do a lot of dinner with a lot of white people, and the one thing you sense from the white community is that you do get a section of the white community that feels very, very guilty about what's happened in the past. And they're like, well, we need to fix this and we need to do right by the country. Some of it's coming from a really, really good place. But that often turns into that bigotry of low expectations that feeds into schemes like BEE. So you have the so-called people who are doing these things in terms of like they're doing it from the right place, but it cahoots, not intentionally, with the patronage, with the bigotry of low expectations, with choosing winners and losers. And this is where it leaves us. It leaves us in a place where we kind of feel like we're stuck in a box, and all the choices that we have in this country, and it's something I wrote in one of my articles, is that in this country we're left with Faustian bargains. We don't really have anything else. Someone is going to have to suffer at some point. People are suffering already, but how we proceed from here will determine how much people suffer, especially the people at the bottom of our society. So that's what I see when I'm kind of like driving around, is that these places are sort of just a window into what's happening in our society and the fraying of our society. Yes, the people in the big cities aren't necessarily feeling it as much as the people who are on the periphery, who are left behind, because in the cities there's still some level of functionality. I mean, it's there. I mean, it's still crumbling, because if you look at Johannesburg, it's a whole another mess. But it's not as bad as other places. Like here in Mthatha right now, my mom pays rates and taxes. They pick up the waste once every 3 weeks. She has to pay other people to do stuff. That's the problem. There's people who turn up at our gate who ask and say, hey, can't you employ me for the day to clean the yard or do this or do that? And sometimes we just have to turn them away and say, listen, we've already got somebody, because they're desperate. Then like, I'll do it for $20. Because even the arguments that you have with people who say, well, a low paying job is exploitation, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, you feel that way, but for the person who's desperate for money, they will take what they can get. And I'm not trying to justify exploitation, etc., etc., because I do think there are bad actors in this country sometimes. But here's the rub. Do you want people to starve or not? Do you want people to be able to purchase stuff for their kids? Do you want people to be able to get some kind of shelter? Do you want people off the street and not homeless? This is the Faustian bargain we are facing. Dawie's put like quite a very technical spin on it, but that's where we are as people. We're left with these choices where, listen, if people don't take low wages, and you talked about the people who are unemployed and unemployable, because that's the bigger problem in my view, is the unemployable part. The people who've been out of work, where it's very difficult for them to get work. This is where we are. We either have to embrace an economy in which can absorb all of these people who don't have skills, or who have a low level of skill, who have a low level of education, and Dawie touched on it. Only half of our kids graduate high school. 78% of our kids can't read or write for understanding in grade 4. This is what we're faced with. Those people grow up and become adults. And what we're faced with is either we embrace that and we embrace a market in which we allow people to come into a labor-intensive economy that absorbs those people, or we will have this situation with government thinking, hey, we can intervene with 350 Rand, and then the government pretends like they are not making a Faustian bargain. Because that's the problem we have with people on the left, is that they are not admitting that they're making a Faustian bargain. Because that's it. They are choosing between a low wage and government interventionism, but the low wage pays more. But they have the emotive sense of it's exploitation.
And I was about to say, Sindile, like I love this rant. It will be clipped. I hope you know that, and it will be put out, because it's absolutely spot on. It's absolutely spot on insofar as the analysis of what we're seeing and what ordinary South Africans see, but the elites, the political elites, refuse to see. John, I must come to you, because there's a lot of points that were touched here, and I'll come to you, Dawie, after that. There's a lot of points that were touched here that we spoke about on Wednesday, insofar as the notion of, and again, at the heart of Sindile's points is the continuous injection of bad policy into an environment where ordinary people can see the bad cost, or rather experience the bad cost of those bad decisions. BEE is at the center of that, where at an everyday level, and I want to chip in here, because Sindile's point speaks to an experience that I had in the township that I grew up in the rural area that I grew up in too, where you're a young chap, you live in a township, Umlazi, my case. I had the benefit of, good grades, being able to go to good schools, and straddling that dual world of leaving Umlazi in the morning to go to urban areas to study amongst other Model C, so-called Model C kids and schools, to be immersed in that middle-class world, and then going home to a poverty-racked lower working class environment where, you know, you're spending your afternoons chilling on the corner with your township homies, most of whom are actually criminals. You know, we all grew up together. We know each other, we respect, we love each other. But some of them have, because of the lack of opportunity, entered into that world of criminality. And one of the things I often remember as we stood on that street corner, we used to be called the Outlaws. There was about 12 of us, 12 guys. We grew up together, boys to men type thing. We're still in touch, by the way. And some of them are watching this. Shout out to the Outlaws. One of the things we often used to talk about is, you know, we would sit on the street corner in the afternoon. I came back from varsity. Others came back from work if they worked. Others came back from petty crime. But anyway, but you'd see these politicians and, you know, the political elites, the tenderpreneurs in particular, driving past us, and everybody knew who they were. You know, you always be like, oh, that's so-and-so who got the mega tender to build all of the houses in Umlazi. Look at them. They're driving the latest German sedan. I wish I could be that. And a part of me then sort of thinks to myself, but hang on, this is the problem, John. And you sort of alluded to it on Wednesday. The problem is the fact that the winners and the losers in society were picked by politicians and not by the market. Because I can tell you now, and Sindile alluded to this, half the guys who are part of the Outlaws are much more competitive, innovative, enterprising, and if they had the opportunity, would be driving those very German sedans. The problem of BEE and affirmative action or employment equity as this supposed way of getting us out of the trouble we're in, John. That's the part of our conversation that we didn't quite finish off on Wednesday, but this constant belief that BEE will continue to save us.
Yeah, well, I'll start out with pointing out that when I wrote that article, I wrote something that BEE was intended to lift the disadvantaged black majority up to the level of the whites who had benefited from apartheid. And a friend of mine who's a contrarian pointed out that he agreed with all of the article except for the fact that whites benefited from apartheid, which is a very contrarian thing to say. And you say, well, obviously they did benefit. But the point he made was more subtle than that, which is that much in the same way as BEE is hurting black people in South Africa, in the same way apartheid also hurt white people in South Africa. It made them less competitive. It denied them the ability to compete with the majority of the population. Mm-hmm. It gave them a smaller economy than they would have had otherwise. You know, they were working in a sort of very state-constrained environment. And it was bad for everyone involved. And that was true then, and it remains true now under the new, you know, color preference. But then as to the question of, you know, how can you explain that BEE is bad if it is actually helping some people? The point is, of course, that you have to ask the question about that which is not seen. So in other words, you do see the 15% of people who do benefit from BEE and are doing very well out of it. But you can only justify BEE if you don't look away from those 15% towards the 85% who are not benefiting and whose lives, as a matter of fact, are worse off. And if you are honest to yourself, you have to say it's not enough for me to look only at the 15% who are driving the snazzy cars, who are doing well, and who will write in the opinion columns to say that I was a beneficiary of apartheid. How can you say that it's a bad system? I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for BEE. That may be true, but you are looking away from the 85% who are being let down by these policies. And that is, I think, what the crying shame is and the thing that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Guys, give me a second here. I must just acknowledge everybody. We're in the last 25 minutes or so of Liberty and Friends. Welcome to it. If you just joined us, hey, ta-da, where were you? We just had some fantastic insights here on the show. I'm going to open it up to you guys, the viewers. It's just your questions from here on out. There are a lot of questions that were asked before. I'm going to pose them to the panel. In this instance, Dawie, I'm going to come to you. There was a question earlier on around savings. You know, some people are obviously worried about their savings at the moment. The question being, is it even worth saving anymore? Should I just blow it all? Was the question from the audience. Another one linked to that was the question around, Dawie, I'm really worried about my being here in this country, whether it's my money or me physically and my family with the state of the economy. Should I be moving my money overseas?
Short answer is yes, you know, and that's a bit of a problem for me because I want to be loyal to South Africa, but but I want to be honest as well. So I advise my clients, and in fact, that is what I do. I take money out of the country, and I do it quite a lot. So my advice to people is make sure that you at least, there's a couple of principles as far as investments go. One is to diversify, and diversify means that you have to take some money out of the country as well. But it is extremely important for a country to save, because without savings you cannot invest, and without investments you cannot grow. And maybe if you allow me, let me just say something that I think we don't say enough.
Sure.
And this is how an economy works. There's a saying in economics that goes like this, and it is, there is no free lunch. That's what we say.
Right.
And that is generally true. But there's one exception. There is one free lunch. And if we understand that free lunch, and if we exploit that free lunch, then we can have a country that becomes wealthy. And here's the free lunch. And the free lunch goes like this. If you have somebody that buys something from somebody else, if there's a transaction happening, both the buyer and the seller gains from this transaction.
That's right.
Because if either of them did not gain from the transaction would not have happened. Let me repeat that. You create wealth out of nothing by simply allowing two people to trade. But there's a very important condition here. You cannot trade if you don't own something. So before you can trade, before you can exploit this amazing thing called the free lunch, private ownership must be established and must be protected. And there's the key. That is really as simple as that. We have to protect private property rights, and we have to create an environment where it's easy for people to trade. And it doesn't matter what they're selling, whether they're selling their labor, whether they're selling something they've manufactured or whatever. But that is the job of the state, to make sure that private property right is protected and to make sure it's easy to trade. Let me just add something else to what Sindile said. I think that is very important. They made a couple of very, very important points as far as men are concerned. And that one thing that I want to add is that, of course, if you don't have a job, if your property is not protected, if you don't have the skills and you're sitting outside somewhere sniffing glue or drinking or whatever, things you lose your self-respect. But it's something that society loses that is even worse, and society loses its fathers. One of the most important things there could be in any society. Of course, women are very important as well, but it is crucially important for fathers to know their children, to influence their boys. And if you really want somebody to be part of a society, you must allow him to sell his labor in order to create a free lunch, in order to create lunch for his kids and to be a father for his children. And I'm afraid if you can't get a job, and if you're not allowed to sell your labor in a free market, then you won't be those things.
Absolutely. Dawie, in fact, as you're on that point, I'll get you everybody else fellas just now. There was an associated question here that touched on pensions. I'm just trying to find it, and I'm quickly scrolling down here. Bear with me, dear viewers. The comments are coming in thick and fast. Thank you for that, dear viewers. But there was a question around, there it is. Dawie, should I take full pension or retirement and invest, or go on monthly payments from the pension fund?
Certainly that is unfair to ask me sort of one-liner questions like that, because it really depends. It depends on many things. It depends on your kind of investments, your requirements, your risk profile, how many children you have, what you plan to do. It depends. Yeah. So my advice is really get a good financial advisor. And remember, financial advisors are not what they used to be 20 and 30 years ago. Today, they are very, very well-qualified people, and do a proper analysis. That's the answer. That's the correct answer. I can't answer whether you should or shouldn't be doing this.
Absolutely. Koketso, I'm going to come to you because Dawie raised a critical point, and we often talk about it. And when we do, we're accused as being, I just shared an article with my friends at the IRR. There's an article that cites me and Umanguzutu Telezi. I'm forgetting the third part. Herman Mashaba. The rise of the black conservatives. And we're being accused of being conservatives because we care about things like the family unit, and a stable society, and we want a moral leadership or they want a moral leadership, as he put it. And there's often this misconception that just caring about these social issues makes you a conservative. But Dawie rightly points out that, it's not a function of necessarily, or as I would put it, it's not a function of being a conservative. It's about recognizing that societies are much better. If you want to talk about advancing the individual, part of that conversation is about strengthening the family, because the family is the first port of call for the individual, if anything, right? Where it's the first place where we're socialized as individuals. And the family's been the biggest, has taken, the biggest knock in South Africa. Whether you want to go back to our colonial days, which broke up families under the Hudson poll tax, for example, that broke up families because it needed to extract male labor from the homelands to what was the burgeoning Vaal industrial base, and then of course the gold mines, right through apartheid, which basically formalized that and codified into various laws, and even today's government, unfortunately, which through various welfare and other bad policies incentivizes or disincentivizes family creation. But the family is an important structure, Koketso.
Yeah, absolutely. I could just go on and on about how important family is, but yeah, thanks for bringing it up, Dawie. This message needs to be said constantly. So statistically, I mean, yeah, since if people don't want to take my word for it, statistically, we know, and ask around, we know that children are likelier to succeed in life, as in make something of themselves when they have both parents. Children are likely to succeed even academically through school and the likes when they have both parents. Children are likelier to, if they have both parents, perpetuate a cycle of also starting families where they have both parents. Again, this is just it's very it's a very broad way to put it, but we do know that not everyone is that fortunate, of course. The issue I have is you have policies that were done both present and past that actually intentionally separate families, and what coincides with that is children not doing so well in terms of comprehension, like reading and performance in school and the like. Children also not making good decisions once they become adults, which then means they become probably they're more likely to be part of the unemployable. So everything goes down to the family. And my issue with leftists is that all of their policies look to break down the family. And it's a very big red flag, because I don't think it's fair that, you should basically damn people to a society or a reality where you don't have the benefit of having a father in the house. I say father specifically because we know women bear children, therefore they are likelier to look after a child than the father is. But I don't think it's actually fair to condemn people to a life of necessarily not having a father because of government or politician policies. It's very disturbing, and you'll typically find that the politicians who actually perpetuate these laws that do this to their population, they're actually at home with their husband or with their wife, raising their kids in a two-parent household, but condemning the rest of society to not grow up in a two-parent household, and therefore creating this buffer where there's definitely the haves and the have-nots. It's very unfortunate, but yeah, the rise of the Black conservative maybe is attributed to people who typically have such an upbringing. I was fortunate enough to be one of them, but yeah, it's one of those things where really the rules don't write themselves. And unfortunately, we're in a position where we have quite a lot of fatherlessness inside of our country, and that has led to a myriad of problems. I actually spoke with a friend this morning about how it's created an environment where gender-based violence is on the increase because of fatherlessness, fatherless homes. And again, statistically, this is just a tongue-in-cheek question, I suppose, but why is it that gender-based violence, in the definition that has been presented to us, why is it only a pandemic in Black and colored communities? It's because those are communities where there's a lot of fatherlessness, or fatherless homes are on the increase, not just in South Africa, but even elsewhere in the world.
Again, you'll obviously have some feminists not who absolutely sort of their heads will be spinning like The Exorcist, even hearing you say this, because it's. But again, and John, let me come to you and Sindile after that. Liberals are often shamed, or there is a concerted effort to try and push liberals out of this conversation. Because we're accused, for example, of, oh, why would you care about the family, they'll say, if you're all about the individual? But the data is absolutely crystal clear, John. If you're going to have a conversation about the South African economy and the poor state that it's in, you've got to straddle the conversation or link the conversation to the outcomes that we see based on poor family structures in the country. Let me add some numbers because we've sort of been skirting around the numbers in this instance. And I did a vlog on this. If I just go back to my notes very quickly, I think it's vlog 105, if I'm not mistaken. But in any event, in this country, John, we have a situation where only 32% of South African children live and are raised with a two-parent household. That is only 32%. The overwhelming majority, 42%, live with just a mom. About 4% live with a father only. But here's the kicker, here's the shocker. A staggering 1 in 5 children in this country live with neither parents. In other words, they're raised or they grow up in a child-headed household. There is no prospect, John, of a stable society going into the future when the numbers look like this.
It's really one of the most difficult issues, I think, that we face in South Africa. And as a liberal, not in the American sense, but sort of the classically liberal sense, the big dilemma that issue poses to me is that I'm not sure what to do about it.
Yeah.
Because as liberal, we wouldn't want the state to mandate how families should be constituted or to order, husband and wife families exclusively. That's not how life works. Sometimes the father and the mother don't get along, and it's actually better for them to split up. And it's better, for the children to stay with one of the parents. So we know that, in terms of overall outcomes, what we'd like is for many two-headed households to be there and children to grow up with both of their parents. But I don't think that it's the role of the government to mandate that. And it's also very difficult for the government to actually do something about that. That really comes down to a societal and a social question. Now, what are the values that matter in your society? What sort of behaviors do you give esteem to, as my colleague Gabriel would say? What is it that gives you prestige? And once you get to a point where you say the most prestigious thing you can do as a man, for example, is to make sure that you are there for your children.
That's right.
And if society values that and gives recognition to that, then we will see that behavior changing. But how do you promote that? I'm not quite sure. Maybe that's something for the churches to do, which, of course, very important in South Africa, to promote this value and say, look, we recognize families come in all shapes and forms and sizes, but ultimately it is quite good if you can make it work out. Try to have two parents in your life. That is best.
Cynthia, can I add to that?
Sure, Dawie, and then
let me give you. I totally agree with you, John. But here's an example, a suggestion from my side. The child support grant, we have 16, 17 million children receiving a child support grant, and the ANC, there's not much that they've done well, but that's one thing that I think we needed in South Africa, is some sort of social safety net. So in a way, I think that really supported a lot of people. But I think we need to change this child support grant, and here are a few suggestions that will actually get to part of this. One is that in order to qualify for a child support grant, you must have the father's name on the birth certificate as well. It's only as that. Before you qualify, you must prove that I've sued the father in order to get the father to assist me to bring up this child, as an example. Or if you can't do those sort of things, some sort of process that makes it a little bit more difficult for you to just get a grant. But here are simple examples. Just prove that I've gone to the father first. He hasn't got the money before the state will support me. Just that. And you will force men to become responsible fathers by that. Because women, like Koketso said, Women are the primary parent because they give birth. But fathers quite often forget, and the state, in a way, with the grant system, perpetuate that, supports that in a way. Just change that small thing. You must prove who the father is, and you must prove you've sued him for support before you get the state to assist you.
Cindy, let me come to you because there's merit in what Dawie is saying. For instance, the last data set that I saw was, I think, 2018, which basically saw a perpetuation of the problem Dawie is alluding to, where of new births registered in the country, only a shocking rather 62% of them had no information on the father on them. So it's a problem that continues to perpetuate itself, and it then feeds into the poor policy response in terms of welfare that the state follows. Now, as a classical liberal, I do believe there is some role for the state insofar as providing a social safety net. It's not a big one, but it surely should be there. But it can be done with incentives that gear people towards the kind of behavior you want to see. I do agree with John, sorry to straddle the argument like this, but I do agree with John that it's not a silver bullet, it's not a perfect solution, and it too will be fraught with all sorts of unintended consequences, externalities as we call them in economics. But surely there is space here, wiggle room to reorientate where we are currently.
Sorry.
Muted. There we go.
Oh, sorry. Two things I was thinking about as the panel was talking. The one is the other side of the fatherlessness dilemma that we have in this country. And part of the data sets that we can find is that when women, the more educated women are, the later they have children, the more likely they are to have children with a man who is suitable for them. So that is the other side. And I was thinking of that in particular to the whole idea of land reform, because as you know, in an economy, everything's kind of like a moving part. Everything affects everything else. So with this whole thing of land reform, one of the things I'd looked into quite a while back was the idea of how land reform doesn't benefit women, and how when it does, women tend to spend that money more responsibly when they do get it, that income, and that includes educating their girls. That includes pushing their girls to get an education and to pick the right sorts of men. Because I do think, yes, fatherlessness is that equation, but I don't think we should separate it from the idea that women are also beings with agency, and that when people respond to their environment, and that I think is part of the problem, because we have this problem in South Africa, and men and women kind of, I think generally speaking, respond differently to it. But I think for a lot of men, they kind of shrink and regress. And for a lot of women, it's you basically, and we see it through the culture with things like blessers and sugar daddies and all of that kind of thing. There's a reason why, if you look at some of the data, that some of the most violent societies in the world are polygamous ones, because all of the men, usually older, suck up all the resources, and the women have to throw themselves at their mercy to sort of get by and get protection, etc., etc. It's kind of like a Game of Thrones scenario that we have in South Africa. And I think that's part of the development, I think, that we need to see in this country. We need to prize education. And I think this is a path where we can agree with, I personally would agree with feminists in terms of saying we need a society that has equity. Because I think equality, mathematical sameness, for me is kind of a dumb idea, because I don't think it works out in real life. But equity in the sense that we value girls. Because in South Africa, I think we have a cultural problem overall of not valuing girls and women in general. I do think there is a problem with that. And I think that flows down to how we encourage young women to get education, to make better choices, and to be people with agency. Because there's one thing somebody always tells me, and it's kind of crude. And I say this with the best of intentions, sex doesn't happen if a woman doesn't want to. And I'm leaving out the whole rape thing. It doesn't happen if a woman doesn't want to. And if women are empowered and they've got a future to look forward to, they are less likely to make decisions where they have to throw themselves at terrible men and do things which they don't really want to do. And I think the second point for me, there was an article on family, and it was done by David Brooks in the New York Times. And I think it's a wonderful article. And he talked about the difference between upper class and working class families. And the difference was this, and I think it's very interesting, and I think it links back to the point I said earlier about places outside our big cities not having an economy. Because I think one of the things that helps upper class families get by with two highly educated parents is that they can hire help to help them with their children. Working class families can't. Traditionally, working class families rely on the wider community and extended family. That has been broken up in South Africa because if a man is or a woman is to get any kind of income, they have to move away from their rural area, their township, their small town, and they have to go to the big cities where life is a lot more distended and you can't necessarily trust your children with other people who have the best interest of your children at heart. So I think when we see this is one of the consequences of government policy in terms of not having an economy in which outside of the big cities in which people can invest and create businesses and create jobs, is that working class families get broken up. It's kind of like what you were saying with apartheid and the continuation. This is what's happening. It's sort of a continuation of that, but it's by design because of the bad policy and the structure of our economy in this country. And I think that's something that we have to bear. If we are the sort of people who are going to argue for free market policy, I think we need to tack it on to important things like family, because I think this is where I think we sometimes lose as people who are, who would term ourselves as liberal or classically liberal, is that our arguments aren't necessarily emotive enough. And I think our arguments make sense and they're the right one for the economy. And I think this precious link between economies outside of our big cities and the formation of working class families, because the majority of people in this country, for at least the next generation, will be working class even if we make the right decisions. And because of that, we need to look at the economies outside of our big cities. We need market economies outside our big cities. We need the formation of families where young men and women have opportunities to work, where they have people they trust, neighbors they've had for 10, 20 years, extended family, people in the community that are known that can take care of their children. It takes a village to raise their family, because the truth is not all families are the same. The structure of the family in some ways is sort of massaged, or how do I say, sort of formed or caressed by the economic situation of the family. So we shouldn't pretend that upper class families, even if they're two-parent households, are the same as working class families if they're two-parent households. I think we need to pay attention to that in terms of saying, listen, our entire country needs help. Leaving people behind is going to break our entire society, not just poverty, but is going to break our society and is going to cause this thing where there is no moral leadership, there is no real family life forming, and children are going to grow up being very, very maladjusted, being very antisocial, and being the sort of people, the horrors we see in our society come from that. The horrors where people don't just want to rape and kill you, they want to torture you too, and cut off your limbs or throw cigarettes or burn you with cigarettes. There's all this horror. You see it all over our society, and part of that is because we've essentially carried on with what happened, what you were saying, Sihle, in apartheid, and the ANC's just doubled down on it in a different way and just carried that on and continued to break apart families. I think, Koketso, you also touched on it. So I think when John asks what we can do, we can contend for what we always contend to, but the important thing is to link it to the important things, the formation of family life, the formation of households, the formation of healthy individuals, whether they are men or women, and the value we attach to people, whether they're men, women, whatever you are, your sexual orientation, that value that says you are a person who has agency, your society encourages you to have agency. It buttresses that with the rule of law, with private property rights, with an opportunity society. And this is what will create the kind of individuals in the future where we can start to move forward and build. It's going to be hard work.
Absolutely.
We can't lie to anybody. It's going to be tough.
Absolutely.
There's going to be fast-in bargains. But we have to contend for what we're saying, because what we're saying as people, when we talk about the economy, we're saying to the dear viewers, the outcome and the effect of that is more families, bigger markets, more employment opportunities. What we're saying is create a virtuous cycle, because an economy is a living thing and people are the economy. And as long as we have people that are distended and people that are broken and all sorts of other things in communities and families, I think part of that will mean our economy is also broken. And I think we can go a long way with that. Our values don't oppose a stronger economy, a free market economy. A free market economy is definitely a moral thing. We need to stop conceding that ground to people who will say, no, you're exploiting, etc., etc., etc. But an economy is a moral thing. It's a free market economy in which people can sell their labor, they can sell their wares, they can trade with each other, is a moral thing, and it leads to better outcomes, and I would argue better and more moral outcomes.
Yeah. And that's the point that Dawie made earlier on, that notion of the buyer and the seller both benefit, because one wants the product more than the money and the other wants the money more than the product. But guys, I must end it off here on that fantastic note. And maybe with that being said, I'm just going to go around the panel with final word and what you'll be looking what you'll be looking at in the week ahead. Dawie, let me begin with you. What are you guys busy there with at the Efficient Group that might benefit people here? If not, what are you focusing on in the upcoming week, and how do we reach you on your social media?
Okay, let me just make a comment. I just want to add on to what Sindile said there, and that is that, we all want the middle class, but people think a middle class is a certain income, it's money. It's not that. A middle class is a certain set of values. That is a middle class. All right, what we're looking for, I think there's something, and we need to talk about this more, and that is this experiment that's going on internationally with central banks creating money out of nothing. And there's a big debate amongst economists, and that debate essentially centers around inflation. Are we going to see inflation? Are we not going to see inflation? Is this a temporary thing? Is it not a temporary thing? And that's a big debate. And I think that is really going to change the world. This experiments, or these experiments of creating money out of nothing, quantitative easing, very low interest rates, that sort of stuff, this thing can potentially go horribly wrong. And I think that's what economists are looking out for. Are we going to see global inflation or not? And that will determine where you should put your money.
Absolutely. Dawie, can I hold you to this? Can I bring you back on the show to discuss this exactly? Because it is a conversation, rightly, that has to be spoken about.
Absolutely. Will be my pleasure.
Perfect. That is Dawie Roodt, of course, the chief economist at the Efficient Group. Sindile, let me come to you. How do the folks reach you, and what will you be looking at going forward in the week?
This week, you will find an article soon enough in that great publication called The Daily Friend. I'm thinking about something. I watched a documentary about something called Sapeurs, which are people who are dandies in the Congo who wear fancy stuff, but they're surrounded by poverty. And it's kind of like such a great metaphor, or let me not say great, it's such an apt metaphor for what happens in South Africa and all the window dressing. So I'll be exploring that in the week to come. You can find me on Facebook. Ignore some of the football and the basketball stuff, or the stuff where I gloat about it, because I will. Liverpool, strong, you'll never walk alone. but you'll find me on Facebook when I get back on. I just took some time off to read, but to regain some of my sanity. We've been through a lot in this country. It's hard work, man, to watch people just burn a country to the ground. So I'll be looking at that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very much.
Thank you, Sindile. Super appreciate that. And I do agree with you as someone who drives around this country, trying to advocate for a lot of the ideas that we speak about here. I see the devastation that you're talking about, and lots of exciting stuff that I'm going to propose with you, Sindile. This will not be the last time the fans on the show see you, and I might even rope you in on the Mazakele campaign, which is exactly this, pushing these ideas into the communities around this country, especially those people who don't watch the show. So that being said, let me go to you, Koketso, brother. What will you be up to? What are you going to be looking at in the next week? And how do the folks find you?
Yeah, firstly, find me, just type Koketso Resane. There's only 7 Resanes, so you're bound to come across me. I'm reading a hell of a lot lately. Funny Sindile mentioned this, about how we shouldn't actually concede ground. So I've been reading up a lot to make sure that, my tiny voice can actually aid those who are refusing to concede ground. So I'm going to credit Douglas Kruger and Joel Pollack on that. So that's how you find me, Koketso Resane, out everywhere. Otherwise, catch them in Patria podcast tomorrow. That is Monday.
Absolutely. That's the Manpatria podcast. Shout out to Mo Denga with that. Last but not least, John, what are you going to be looking at in the next week? Sindile rightly mentioned the Daily Friend. Remember, dear viewer, if you want to catch the Daily Friend, it's www.dailyfriend.co.za for all your news, opinion, and analysis. John, what can we expect from you this week?
Well, I was also going to mention the Daily Friend, but you've done that already, so thank you very much. Give it a shout out. Some great stuff published there every single day of the week. What we will be looking at this coming week, I think primarily, will be the postponement of the elections. We think that this is a very risky thing. It does not have enough justification. And we are trying to fight it because we think those elections should actually take place as planned on the 27th of October. If they don't, it will require breaking the constitution. And it may well be that the Constitutional Court judges will find some arguments that enable that to be justified. I'm a bit skeptical of that.
Prospect that. Yeah.
So that's a good topic for conversation. I think if you haven't covered it already, the elections is a really, really important thing. And then the other thing I'd like to say is that people say when days are dark, friends are few. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that we have friends here on the show. I was looking at the comments on the side from time to time. And that is really the one thing that always inspires me and gives me hope for South Africa or South Africa's people. Because I think most of them are, solid, reliable, dependable, middle ground people that you can rely on to help you in a pinch. And these are the good people of South Africa are the ones who are going to save the country.
Absolutely. Fully agreed with that sentiment. That is, of course, John Endres, the CEO-elect of the South African Institute of Race Relations. Let me thank all of my guests for having been on the show. And, of course, dear viewer, thank you for watching. Oh, my goodness. You guys make the show what it is. And I just mentioned earlier on the Mazakele campaign, and ironically, John mentioning the elections. It's meant to coincide with the elections, but if they, and I say they, insofar as the politicians, if they postpone this thing, that will be a serious affront to our democracy. And I will be taking to the street this week to actually prosecute this issue. And I'll hopefully have the likes of John back on the show, maybe even some other colleagues from the IRR to discuss this as we say no to any delay in the election. You must have your right to choose your political leadership. Don't let the political elites delay and stall and try and bribe their way out of the anger, the collective anger that we can clearly pick up in this society. So shout out to the IRR for taking that issue on. Thank you for watching. As I said, look out for the Mazakele campaign. That is me going around the country, Dorpi to Dorpi, community to community, pushing the ideas into communities that you heard on the show. I'm looking forward to that. It's definitely time that we begin to prosecute the battle of ideas. With that being said, thanks for watching. And a reminder, as I always do at the end of every show, for you to never trust a commie.